Hello, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Bree Hogue, and I'm the sales manager at Powell City of Books here in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Mario Livio in conversation with Adam Frank. This evening's event will include a discussion and a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question of either of our authors tonight, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, you can upvote that question. You can support Mario Livio and Powell's by purchasing a copy of Galileo and the Science Deniers. A link to buy the book was included in your registration email and will also be shared in our chat feature a few times this evening. Mario Livio is an internationally known astrophysicist, speaker, and best-selling author of previous books, including The Golden Ratio and Brilliant Blunders. He has published more than 400 scientific articles, significantly contributing to topics ranging from cosmology, supernova explosions and black holes, to extrasolar planets and the emergence of life in the universe. Dr. Livio worked for 24 years with the Hubble Space Telescope and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His newest book, Galileo and the Science Deniers, is a biography of Galileo. Galileo is known as the founding father of observational astronomy, modern physics, science, and the scientific method. Disturbed by rampant science denial in America and around the world that has only intensified in recent years, Livio began researching the life, ideas, and actions of Galileo, who encountered similar pressures centuries ago. Livio draws on his own scientific expertise to provide new avenues into understanding how Galileo reached his bold conclusions about the cosmos and the laws of nature. A free thinker who followed the evidence wherever it led him, Galileo was one of the most significant figures behind the scientific revolution. This evening, Livio is joined in conversation by Adam Frank. Astrophysicist, writer, and commentator Adam Frank is a leading expert on the final stages of evolution for stars like the sun. His computational research group at the University of Rochester has developed advanced supercomputer tools for studying how stars form and how planets evolve. Frank's most recent book is Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. Mario and Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So let me just start off by, I just want to tell everybody a little bit about Mario. I have known Mario for a long time, so I'm going to tell two little Mario Livio stories that give you a sense of him. So I met Mario first when I was just a wee graduate student, and it was one of the first scientific meetings I ever went to. I think it might have been in France. And I was still learning, that we were studying something about what happens to the sun at the end of its lifetime. And, some of the talks were good, some of the talks weren't. And then Mario came out. And I remember thinking like, this was all new to me. So I was like, I'm not sure what he's talking about, but I definitely want a few of them. Because he was so energetic and so clear and so articulate about the theory he was talking about and its importance. So there was a line of graduate students all sitting there. And we were all like, wow, what was that? And I would like to note that the theory that Mario was promoting actually, has turned out to be true. I still work in the field, and it turns out that it was an important idea. The second Mario Livio story I want to tell you about is, over the years, Mario was a mentor to me. He's really one of my science heroes in terms of one of the people who, I learned from. I felt like I learned at the feet of the master. And at one point, I'm a computational physicist. Mario is a theorist. We don't have to go into the differences. But one time I was using this new tool. We were working on a paper, and I was using this new tool called Mathematica, where you could compute you could do algebra or algebraic equations on the computer. And I showed Mario, I was so proud of this thing that I'd done, this long calculation with Mathematica. And of course, Mario looked at the first part and said, you can show this in 2 lines. And I was like, ew. So, that was, once again, Mario's skill. He's, very much in the old school of, you can work this out with pencil and paper. Thank you very much. So with that introduction, Mario, it is a great honor to have this chance to talk with you today.
Thank you. It's my honor. And you've been too kind.
But anyhow.
No, it's very true. But so let me just start off. My first question for you is, why Galileo? You know, there are many figures during this incredible period of genius in science. So before there was Kepler, and then after there's Newton and Leibniz. So, you know, as both a scientist and a writer, you know, what is it that brings you to Galileo in particular?
Galileo is really one of the most fascinating people in the history of science, because he was not only a great scientist and, you know, a founder at some level of the scientific method and things of that nature, but, you know, he was in his fight for intellectual freedom, the way he treated other people, which was not always nice. You know, he was very nice to people from his own family or to his supporters, but he had a sharp tongue and an even sharper pen against, you know, all the people who disagreed with him. So he was, in that sense, a more sort of human being. I mean, you know, Newton was, first of all, he was a mystic to some extent. And also, he was a person that, you know, almost never made any mistakes, you know, except in alchemy, you know, and things like this. He made no mistake. Galileo made mistakes, you know. I mean, he had models that were completely wrong. And so I really got very attached to this. Plus, there is the drama, you know. I mean, he was put on trial, he was, you know, convicted, things like that, and so on. So he really stands out to me.
So it's really, and so it's not just his scientific achievements, which I want to unpack a little bit, but yeah, the story himself, right? I mean, there's not many other scientists who had to face, you know, so much actual peril.
Exactly, yes. You know, he put, you know, basically, well, you know, I'm not sure if he put his life on the line in the sense that, you know, he was almost 70 years old. It didn't look like, you know, they would kill him or torture him. But, you know, they did threaten him with torture. And, you know, we had an example. I mean, Giordano Bruno, during Galileo's life in 1600, was burnt at the stake. So yeah, he was, you know, he was an interesting character.
Yeah. I want to get back to you. I was going to ask you about Bruno, but before we go there, let's just talk about Galileo as a scientist. I mean, let's break this up into two parts, because the amazing thing about Galileo was there was astronomy and then there was physics. So can you talk a little bit first about his astronomy? Like, why do we revere Galileo for the discoveries he made?
Yes, of course. So Galileo, you know, he did not invent the telescope. Some people think he invented the telescope. No, the telescope was invented in Holland, but he very quickly, you know, adopted this instrument, constructed his own telescopes, polished his own lenses. And, you know, the available telescopes at the time, you know, at the magnification of something like 4, he very quickly brought it to more than 20. And once he had that telescope, also, that was also in itself interesting. You know, I mean, you know, he could have spied on his neighbors, or, you know, in Venice could have looked at ships. Instead, he looked at the heavens. So he looked at the heavens, and there, you know, he discovered many things. So let me just name a few. I mean, so first of all, he looked at the moon. He looked at the moon, and other people looked at the moon. There was this astronomer, Harriot, looked at the moon. But if you look at what Harriot drew from what he saw from the moon, you will not understand anything. And indeed, Harriot hardly understood. Galileo used here his artistic education and his understanding of light and shadow to actually understand that what he was seeing was really a very rugged surface with mountains, with craters. You know, he even made an attempt to measure the height of a particular mountain and things like that. So that was the moon. Then, you know, he turned his thing to other things. So when he looked at Jupiter, he discovered 4 satellites of Jupiter, 4 moons, which today we call the Galilean satellites. This was enormous, because you see, I mean, the 2 theories that were battling here was, you know, one that came from ancient Greece, which said that everything revolved around the Earth. Then there was the Copernican theory, which Galileo, you know, became convinced was correct, that no, all the planets, including the Earth, revolve around the sun. Now, the objectors to this used to say, well, if the Earth is just another planet, how come it's the only planet that has a moon? Well, Galileo showed that Jupiter has 4 moons, not just 1. Second, they said, oh, how can the Earth move around the sun and not lose its moon? Well, here was Jupiter revolving around something, be it the sun or the Earth, and not losing its 4 moons. So these were very, very important discoveries. You saw the phases of Venus. Venus, because it's between the Earth and the sun, almost always, and when it revolves around the sun, when it's farthest from Earth, it should look small and full. When it's closest to Earth, it should look larger and dark. And he showed that that's indeed the case, which would not have happened had it orbited the Earth. So in a series of such observations, you know, he really, you know, both gave strong evidence for the Copernican model, although never actually succeeded truly to show that the Earth itself was moving.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Like, did he, you know, did he ever actually prove it? You know, did he actually offer convincing proof? It was all.
No, he never offered convincing proof that the Earth was moving. He thought he had convincing proof from his theory of the tides, the ocean tides.
Yeah.
He thought that because of the way the Earth spins around its axis and revolves around the sun, this is what causes the tides. But that model was in itself completely wrong, and it's not the reason for the tides. It turns out that in the observations of the paths of sunspots, spots on the sun, actually one can show that the Earth is moving from that. And Galileo at one point even hints that he thinks he proved from that, but he doesn't give any details. So you know, he probably didn't.
Let me ask you a question about this, because about this, you know, what's happening here, right? Because when you think about the magnitude of the discoveries he's making, like nobody's ever really, the moon, you know, either it's a man in the moon or it's a bunny rabbit or whatever, you know, to actually see this or to see the drawings, that, I mean, what I'm interested in is the effect that this had on the culture. You know, and I'm wondering, can you think of anything like relatively modern, even the last 100 years, that has had such a profound effect, like just like visual evidence for people to be like, oh my God, you know?
Yeah, I think, you know, in modern times, you know, okay, maybe, you know, when we discovered that there are galaxies other than the Milky Way, you know, something like that, you know, that it's not just the Milky Way, there are other galaxies. You know, when Hubble showed that the Andromeda galaxy is actually, you know, a different galaxy, things like that. But you see, you're right that this was very important because, you know, from Aristotle, the thought was that there are all these things terrestrial, which can be corrupted and they can die and full of blemishes, and are these celestial things where everything is pristine and perfect and no blemishes and nothing. And here he comes and shows that the surface of the moon is just like the surface of the Earth. And the sun has sunspots, these blemishes, these dark areas on the surface of it. So this was really a revolution in thinking. And the Milky Way, by the way, observed, you know, so the Milky Way, to those people before the telescope, it looked like some sort of continuous band of light. But he showed that this breaks up into these, you know, many, many stars, which have different brightnesses and are at different distances and so on. So this was, in some sense, the first journey into, you know, astronomy outside the solar system.
Right. The universe was very small. I mean, you know, to them it seemed big, but I mean, it was still a relatively small universe. And so, this was the beginning with the telescope of enlarging. Because, you know, what's interesting about the Copernican revolution, which Galileo played such an important role, is like one day everybody's looking at the sun saying like, oh, look, the sun's coming up. you know? And then later on, it's like, no, no, no. You know, 2 days later or whatever, after the revolution, it's like, no, the horizon's going down. And you think like, what? How did that change happen? You know, how did that shift occur culturally, you know, not just among the scientists, but how did it seep out into the, and Galileo played a big role in that.
Exactly, one of the biggest roles, you know, I mean, well, Kepler was a person who also adopted the Copernican model, you know, right from the start, but his reasons were also different, you know.
Yeah.
He was a very religious person, you know, he liked this idea of having, you know, everything looked to him like the Trinity, you know, things like that.
Right.
But he definitely adopted the Copernican model.
But Galileo, and so this is something I wanted to ask about. Galileo popularized the Copernican model, right? I mean, one of the things as my own reading was I get this vision of Galileo as being like a rock star. He was like, you know, my understanding is he'd give these lectures and, you know, thousands of people would show up and it was like, you know, there was smoke pots and guitars. I mean, tell me more about Galileo's role as a public figure.
Well, you see, this is also very, very important. Galileo did something that you and I try to do today, only that at his time it was really incredible. You see, all science at the time was written in Latin. And it is true that all the truly educated people studied Latin. But Galileo wanted to make his discoveries understood even by not that educated people. So he started writing his books in Tuscan, you know, in Italian, basically, you know, so that more people will be able to read it. You know, he writes a letter to a friend and says, everybody must be able to understand this. So he writes it like this. And not only that, he says, oh, some people probably think that in these fat books, there are things that are above our heads, you know. No, you know, like the scientists, you also have eyes and the senses and so on, and you can understand all these things. So this is why, you know, he was such a big popularizer. He gave lectures, he wrote in Tuscan, you know, all that.
So, so like these lectures, I'm just interested. So where did these lectures occur? How did like normal Italians know, like, hey, Galileo is speaking tonight, let's go?
Oh, well, you see, so here is another thing. Galileo was, well, he lived in late Renaissance, but he was also a Renaissance person, right, in the sense that we use that sentence today. Because, you know, he is, like I said, he studied drawing. He was very, very versed in the great Italian poets, you know, Dante, Ariosto, Tasso. You know, he knew by heart, you know, things like that. He had his friends, he had these great painters. Cigoli was his friend, Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the greatest painters of the Renaissance. She was a personal friend. So, for example, he gave 2 lectures which were done by the Academy of Florence. So it's the Academy that announced that he's giving lectures on Dante's Inferno, the location and the structure of Dante's Inferno. And, you know, he used physics to explain that. It turns out that in that particular lecture, he made a serious mistake too, but he actually used physics. And, you know, even though he did a mistake in that lecture, because he didn't, at the time, he didn't understand that when you increase things, make them bigger and bigger, their strength needs to be stronger if they need to hold up.
Yeah.
But he did come back to that in his last book and corrected his mistake. Clearly, this thing bugged him, you know, over the years.
That's great. Before we go on, I want to note for people, if you have questions, please, you know, you can enter them via Zoom. Because, you know, Mario and I, we're going to, you know, we'll talk until maybe 22, and we'd like to have a lot of time for questions. So please, you know, it doesn't have to be about the book. And, you know, Mario has studied everything from black holes to, you know, even done thinking about other civilizations. So anything, you know, you guys are interested in, please put in questions. So Mario, let's get, you know, in the 20 minutes that we have now, you know, still left in our time, I want to get to the trial and to the science denial as well and its relevance for now. So can you tell us sort of like, how did this trial happen? He's such a popular guy. Who is he angering? How did he end up angering? And then how did the trial play out?
Yeah, so the thing is, you know, politically, he was not particularly clever. And like I said, he had a very sharp tongue and pen. And the Pope at that time, you know, Pope Urban VIII, he was a personal friend of Galileo. He really was a friend of Galileo from before he became Pope, when he was Cardinal Maffeo Barberini. You know, had great admiration for Galileo. But he had certain views, and his views were that at that time, you know, the Copernican model could be used as a mathematical tool to save the appearances, they used to say. You know, yeah, you could use it as a hypothesis, but it doesn't reflect reality. Galileo mistook that to think that he could write a book where he can discuss this, you know, as long as maybe he doesn't say that that's how reality is. But this was, you see, already in the 1630s. And in 1616, there was a decree of the church against the Copernican model. And he was specifically forbidden from teaching or holding or supporting the Copernican model. But he still thought that he can somehow get away. And he wrote this book, The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. And the book was just one big advocacy for the Copernican model.
Right.
Now, his friends realized that it wouldn't be published like this. He had to get permission of the church to publish. So at the Pope's request, in a way, he added a preface and the conclusion, which seemed to say, yeah, but we actually don't know. At the end, we cannot really conclude anything. But, you know, anybody who read the book could see that this was added as an afterthought, because the whole book, it ridicules those who don't believe in the Copernican model. And not only that, to add insult to injury, he put the words of the Pope in the mouth of Simplitio, was this guy in the book. The whole book is written as a conversation among three people. The guy who is an avid Aristotelian who objects to the Copernican model. So that did not fly very well either. So he was put on trial. Now, I want to emphasize something, and that's very important. Very often, people say that the Galileo affair was a clash between science and religion. It wasn't, and Galileo never saw it as such. Galileo was himself a religious person, as Pope John Paul II himself recognized.
Right.
The clash was between literal interpretations of the biblical text and science. Namely, for example, you know, in the book of Joshua, Joshua says that the sun should stand still and not the earth. So that was considered to be against the Copernican model. Galileo argued, listen, the Bible is not a science book. You know, he used the words of Cardinal Cesare Baronio, who said, the Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how heavens go. You know, so he argued that the Bible doesn't make mistakes. So when there is an apparent conflict between a literal interpretation of the biblical text and science, it means that we didn't understand correctly. We have to interpret it differently.
Right.
This was his argument. But at the end, that didn't fly. He was found vehemently suspected of heresy, which was 1 degree lower than Giordano Bruno, who was found to be heretical and was burnt at the stake. And therefore, you know, he was forced to recant. He read an abjuration, which was very humiliating. He basically took back, you know, most of his life's work on his knees, you know, before the Inquisition.
Wow. So was the trial, was the trial as dramatic as the chalk circle? Did the trial have that kind of, in your research, have that kind of potency?
Well, you see, I mean, first of all, the trial itself, probably there were only like 3 or 4 people in the trial. There was the prosecutor, Vincenzo Maculano, was the commissary general, and there was somebody who helped him with the interrogation, and there was somebody who took notes. It was not as if, all the cardinals sat there and I don't know what. But when he read the abjuration, yes, there were 7 cardinals sitting there. And look, it was dramatic. He was on his knees, 69 years old, saying, I, Galileo, son of Vincenzo Galileo, I detest, and this everything that I said, and I will never say it again, and things like that. And then he was condemned to house arrest, which was not horrible because he lived in his own home, but this was for 8.5 years.
Yeah.
He didn't leave his home. So, it was certainly not a pleasant. Listen, we have now been under lockdown for 2 months, and
3 months and we're going crazy.
Yeah, he was for 8.5 years. So,
All right, so let's sort of bring this to the question of so there was an example of a government, unhappy with a scientific theory and, doing what it needed to do to squash that scientific theory. And, we've always looked back to this story, as like in the chalk circle, this story's always been dramatized as like this was, Galileo was a hero for science because, of his standing up. And we thought like those days are over, right? Oh, that's crazy. That'll never happen again because now, science, we all take antibiotics and fly in airplanes. So yes. Actually, here's my questions about what's going on now. Dear Mario, what the heck is going on? Why is it going on? What can anyone do about it? And what does Galileo's history tell us that's helpful with what's going on with science denial now?
Yes. So look, unfortunately, science denial still lives very strongly today. And we see this in a number of, now the reasons are different. You see, as I pointed out in Galileo's case, first of all, he, did something against a certain injunction that was against him. So in that sense, the church was within its right to find him guilty. But the reason for the clash really at the end was this clash between literal interpretations of the Bible and this. So it was some form of religiosity, okay, that was at stake. If you look today, religiosity plays some role. For example, with those who want to teach intelligent design in science classes, side by side with Darwinian evolution, okay? So that it still has a similar motivation. But if you look at other instances of science denial, like this, the question of climate change, about which you also wrote,
right.
in your book and so on. So there, the main reason has to do with political conservatism, with certain political views, a bit with the fact that we are in an election year, and things like that. So the reasons are different, but the effect at the end is the same. Because you see, you don't have to take everything. How shall I put it? If you look, for example, let's say it's something very simple, and this is completely non-political, non-partisan, I'm talking about facts. Yes, you look at the carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere. And you can measure this. This has been measured directly in the past 50 years. And before that, through ice cores, which go back 800,000 years. And you look at that, and you don't just look at the actual numbers of the concentration. You look at the rate of change. How fast is it changing? And you see that in the past 50 years, the rate of change is unprecedented
Right.
in the past 800,000 years, So this tells you something. So even if you think, for example, oh, it's not all due to humans, I don't know what, but clearly human activity isn't helping the situation. So, so you should do something about this. Then there is science denial. There are people who don't vaccinate their children. Galileo would have been, he would not have believed it. How is this possible? People, what? They put the health of their children at risk, So what's the lesson here? The lesson is really very simple at the end. It is never safe to bet against the judgment of science. Never safe. But if something like life on Earth or human life, as in the case of now COVID-19, yes, is at risk, to take such a bet is just unconscionable. How can you do that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's my point, basically. This is the lesson that, we can learn from the Galileo affair.
Well,
don't bet against the science.
Right. Well, that's, and it's funny because, as someone who's written for a long time about science denial, a number of times I've said, science will have the last word because, what's going to happen. It's like with what's going on with COVID down in the South. It's like, wow, if only we had something that could have predicted that was going to happen. It's like, oh, yeah, we do. But I'm stunned by the degree to which science denial, at least in this country in particular, runs so much deeper than even I could have imagined. Because you see what's happening, that in the face of all of this, people are still like, oh no, it's worse than the flu. You can't believe the government. Among science deniers, among certain groups, so that are actually a fairly large section of the population, COVID is still a Chinese hoax, or it's not really that bad, or whatever. There's QAnon now happening, the conspiracy theories.
Because we have gone through almost 2 months where we have been told things like, oh, there are 15 cases which very soon are going to be down to 0, and
Right.
and statements like of that kind. And people also come and bring me as examples. They say, oh, at the beginning, Fauci was saying, don't wear masks. And now he's saying this. So you cannot even believe the scientist and I don't know what. Okay, we know exactly why he said at the beginning, don't wear masks. There weren't enough masks. He didn't want there to be a run on the masks so that all the medical professionals, will not have enough masks,
Right.
Now everybody's saying, what? Have you ever gone to a hospital and so don't you see the people there wearing masks, all the people there? This is so, but now this has become a political question, whether you wear a mask or not. I mean,
Right.
as if there is a question here that wearing a mask can help. Is it the full solution? Of course not. It isn't. But wearing a mask helps. So wear a mask.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting about what's happening now is you also see the role of leadership, right? Because in some sense, if, as we've seen in many other countries, right? If there's leadership that says, of course you wear a mask, of course we trust science, then people who really have these crazy ideas, they're marginalized, as they should be, because they're really putting everybody's health at risk, because you really need the public to be like, listen, you're kind of nuts. The earth is not flat. You have absolute every right to believe that, but as a society, we can't function if we're basing, we're building satellites with your crazy idea. So
look, there is an example that I don't remember who I heard, giving, but it's a very good example. If a hurricane is coming,
right,
and you're told that it's going to hit Florida, let's say, or something like this, right? Then, the high officials tell you, oh, you have to evacuate or this or right, and so on. and you evacuate because you know that your life depends on this. Yes, you don't say, oh, the government will not tell me what to do and I don't know what. You understand that there is a danger here, right? We are in the same situation precisely now. And look, there is a quote that I love to say because it is so, the situation we're in is so dangerous, not just in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of the general way that people think. This was said by Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. And she said, you know, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people who no longer know the distinction between fact and fiction or between true and false.
Right.
You know, that is the danger. You know, when people don't see the difference between true and false. So, yeah. And another point that's important to make, and you have made, I think, also many times, science is not always right, but science corrects itself.
Right.
Sometimes the correction happens very quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time for the correction, but it does correct itself. Right. And this is very, very important. I mean, you know, and so as more data become available, even, you know, the recommendations may change.
Right.
And so on. So this is how it is. It's about climate change. It's about COVID-19. It's, you know, it's about anything that relies on science. But science is our best tool, the best tool we have.
Right.
Not perfect, but it's the best we have.
Right. Let me ask you one last question, and then we'll go to take some questions. And I want to talk about, because I know this is near and dear to your heart, science and the arts, the two cultures. That famous, you know, quote by C.P. Snow about that there's these two cultures, the scientific culture and the culture of the humanities. You know, what's your view on that in general, and how sort of, you know, do you think Galileo fits into this?
Well, Galileo is a perfect example of a person who would not have even known what C.P. Snow talks about, because C.P. Snow talks about that there develops this culture of so-called intellectuals who come from the humanities, who know nothing about the sciences, and there is this culture of scientists who know nothing about the humanities, and that there is this schism developing between these two cultures. Now, Galileo, as I pointed out, he really, you know, inhabited both worlds very comfortably. He knew poetry, he knew how to draw, he had these artist friends, you know, and all that. So that fit very nicely. The question is, what's happening today? And today, some people argue that, you know, the situation is somewhat better than when C.P. Snow talked about it in the 1950s. And some people say that it's because of people like you, like humbly me and others who, you know, try to make science more accessible to the general public and to this. I would, you know, if you look at the books behind me, and every room in my house is like this, you will see that most of these are art books. I'm an art lover, even though I'm a scientist by profession. And the way I see this is, you know, as scientists, we try to explain the universe, if you like, explain and make predictions. As humanists, we try to give our human or emotional response to the universe. So the two things, I think, really complement each other in a very important way. And I think that, you know, we should strive to have, you know, more of this. Now, you know, there are people who would say, yeah, but there is this, you know, notion that today you need to be a specialist, and to be a specialist, maybe you need 10,000 hours, you know, to do something. And so even though that was denied by the author of the original article, but
Right,
never
original
mind.
study.
Yes, but still, you know, it is true that to become a specialist, you do need to invest a large amount of time into that. I mean, you and I invested lots of time in astrophysics, right?
Right.
But what is also true is that information now is much more accessible to everybody, literally at our fingertips, right? I mean, we hold this and, you know, we can access a million things immediately, right? So it goes much faster. And second, we live much longer. We live about twice as long as people lived at the time of Galileo.
Right.
So there is time, you know, there is time to know something about this and something about that. You don't have, the fact that to be a specialist, you need a certain amount of time doesn't mean you have no time left to do anything else. There is time.
All right. Well, that is on that answer. There may be some people who want to, ask Mario more about this, but let me just come to some of the questions because some really great questions that people put in. Here is one that I liked. Wasn't he able to send out some further work while under lockdown, and wasn't he protected by some in the church, which was why he wasn't found to be a heretic? That's a nice piece of
So he did send out, I mean, his last book was printed in Holland by Elsevier. Actually, the publishing house still exists today. Yes. So, yes, he managed to smuggle a book with a French ambassador out of Italy and the manuscript, and this was published in Holland. So he did do that. He also had visitors. He was allowed visitors. He just wasn't allowed to hold like conferences or discussions of Copernican model and so on. And his visitors were carefully selected. I mean, but for example, the poet John Milton visited him, and you know, who wrote Paradise Lost, and was very actually impressed by that visit. Milton was, and he actually wrote a very, very strong plea for freedom of thought, Areopagitica, which actually was used even when the U.S. Constitution was written, where he speaks about freedom of thought, and he laments the fact that in Galileo's case, this was taken away from him.
Interesting. Here's a nice question. Did the Catholic Church double down on Galileo because they also felt threatened by scientific advances in other cultures and religions? Is the Islamic, in the Islamic world, weren't they doubting Ptolemy's theory for almost 800 years? So is that, I mean, that's a general question, just about in general, you know, other, you know, we always think about Galileo going forward that he started science, but what also shoulders was he standing on?
So, well, you know, first of all, he knew about what Kepler did. He corresponded with Kepler. At first, they were very friendly. Then they had disagreements, as Galileo had with almost everybody. He corresponded with other scientists, with some of which, again, very acrimonious correspondence. But he did correspond with other mathematicians. He talked and corresponded with the Jesuit mathematicians at the Roman College in Rome and so on. Now, concerning other religions, well, you see, this was the time where the Protestants were there and the 30-year war was raging. So yes, the Catholic Church actually felt very threatened by these rise of Protestants. And the Pope felt that he needs to be very, very strong on Catholic principles. So this actually almost certainly contributed to the harsh way in which they treated Galileo. Yes.
So this is a nice question that sort of builds on that, which is, you know, going a little bit deeper into what happened to Galileo. Is it true that the Inquisition court wanted to reach a quiet compromise with Galileo? and not punish him. But Pope Urban was so mad at him for putting words in the mouth of simplitio, dumbhead, basically, in the book, that he felt betrayed and insisted the Inquisition punish him and would not allow the compromise. Is that true?
That is actually a theory. One of the Galileo scholars suggested that there was an attempt to reach a plea bargain. That basically Galileo will be given a very light punishment if he, recants and so on and so forth. There are people who say, no, there is no evidence that there was a plea bargain. There are some who say, actually, in some sense, maybe there even was a plea bargain, because at the end, the punishment that was given to him was relatively light. In fact, the first 6 months he actually spent in the house of the Archbishop of Siena, and he lived very, very comfortable life. Then he moved on to his own villa, and where he spent, the rest of his life. So, it is not obvious whether there was a precise plea bargain. There are some letters written by the prosecutor, Vincenzo Maculano, that seem to suggest that there may have been some form of plea bargain there on this. Now, it is not, however, true that Urban was just, mad at putting his words in the mouth of Simplitio. That is not actually true. What Urban, I think, was really mad about was the fact that he explained to Galileo very, very clearly that he thought that one could never find a real proof for the Copernican system, that basically God is almighty and can do things in a million ways that we cannot even think about. So that you cannot take any model and say, this is what reality is like. And to him, Galileo betrayed him by not somehow doing that. And plus, there were a couple of other people around the Pope which tried to convince the Pope before the book was published that the book is okay, and he didn't, at the end was very upset by that.
Okay, here's a good question. Has literature, Kessler's The Sleepwalkers, or more importantly, Brecht's Galileo, influenced your understanding of physics or your writing of your book?
Well, I wouldn't say that Kessler's book, enhanced my understanding of physics, because I'm a physicist. So, right. I mean, I knew physics irrespective of that book. Kessler's attitude towards Galileo, as there are a few others, is very, very negative, extremely negative, very hostile, I would say, towards Galileo. As I think I tried to emphasize, Galileo was not the nicest person. He really wasn't. And he was very self-righteous. He was very full of himself. And no question, much of what he did was to enhance his own reputation. But, where do you exactly draw the line? For example, he insisted that telescopes will be sent all across Europe for people to see with their own eyes, what he discovered. Now, it is true that those telescopes were sent to influencers, but that was also smart because, this is how you get the things to be known. So there are people who hate Galileo and, and would say bad things about him. I take him the way he is, perhaps not the nicest person, but I still think a great thinker and a great scientist.
What was, so this is a good question. What was the public reaction to the verdict? Was there an outcry, or people were like, okay, whatever? So,
well, his friends and supporters were, of course, quite shocked. And there is a very important letter from René Descartes, the famous philosopher and scientist, who writes to a mathematician friend that when he heard about the sentence of Galileo and that his books have been prohibited, you see, his book was put on the index of prohibited books,
Right.
where it stayed until the middle of the 19th century. That when he read that, he almost thought of burning all his papers, he said. So the sentence of Galileo in Italy had a very chilling effect on all progress in science. In Europe, somewhat less in general, but still, from this letter of Descartes, we see that he had an influence, yes.
It's interesting because, right, if we're talking about science denial now, I mean, we see the effect of the government, the EPA changing its rules, and one doesn't have to imagine things going much further to see that, certain scientific views on climate change, could get you in trouble. Certainly if you work for the government and people have been censored or been, denied access, I'm not allowed to talk to the press, both here and in Canada for a while. Now Canada dealt with that, but certainly here we see a lot of those issues. So this is a very interesting question. Galileo was famously influenced by the plagues of his time as well. How do you think the current pandemic may influence the current and future scientists?
Yeah, so Galileo was indeed influenced. I mean, in one of his travels from when he wanted to travel from Florence into the Papal State, the plague was going on, so they didn't allow to cross. He was quarantined. He was supposed to be quarantined for 24 days. I think at the end he was only quarantined for 18, but he was quarantined, before. So he was definitely. How does the current pandemic? What does it do? Well, I'm now formally retired, but budgets of universities have been slashed left and right, and courses have been canceled. Students, numbers of students are perhaps dropping. So this will have an effect. There is no doubt about this. In all professions, we shouldn't single out science. There are people who are hurt even worse than that, of course, who lose their entire livelihood and businesses and so on. But there is no question that at the same time, with budgets being cut, this will have an effect.
Yeah.
I have my youngest daughter is finishing her PhD this summer, and her prospects for finding a job in the academia, which is what she would like, at the moment look extremely gloomy.
Yeah, no, things are definitely, I think not the flip side, but what is interesting is because the tools are available, you saw how rapidly science, the science on COVID, the virology models were just like, whoa, bouncing around the internet, people working on, there was a whole community of astronomers who were like, I'm stuck at home, I'm just I'm gonna write models for virology. But I mean, really, it's been interesting to see how very different models of science are also kind of emerging out of this, much faster, more.
You're absolutely right. And indeed, I have many colleagues who have embarked on doing mathematical modelings of epidemiology, which were usually done only by epidemiologists, and
right.
Now they are doing all that.
I'm not sure how the epidemiologists feel about all these physicists being like, hey, you can solve this. And they're like, nah, we've worked on this. Thank you very much.
Because one should be very careful. I mean, scientists should be the first to admit that they don't know everything.
Right.
And if you are strong in mathematical modeling, okay, do the mathematical modeling, but then leave the interpretation to the people in the field. Yeah.
What happened? Here's an interesting question. Wait, where did it go? Here it is. Quote unquote, they persecuted Galileo is the go-to line for many a charlatan and crank and denier. How can one counter that statement while respecting Galileo's struggle? So if someone, has the earth is flat, they're like, well, they persecuted Galileo, they're persecuting me too. How do you?
Yeah, this is a complete logical fallacy. It even has a name. It's called the Galileo Gambit. So people use this when all those who deny the reality of climate change use that. They say, oh yeah, they persecuted Galileo and he was right and everybody else was wrong. Yeah, you know, Galileo was right, not because he was one against the many. That's not what made him right.
Right.
He was right because he happened to be right. Most of the time, when you have an opinion that's different than the rest of the scientific community, it means you're wrong. That's most of the time. In some very rare cases, you may be right. But you know, at the moment, 97% of scientists, especially atmospheric scientists, you know, agree that climate change is caused by humans, you know, and also agree on, you know, perhaps what type of steps should be taken. The same way that, you know, most scientists agree on what steps should be taken against the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so on. So, yeah, so the logic there doesn't work this way.
My fact, because I've had this when I've given climate change talks and somebody has stood up and said something like that. And so my favorite response is like, oh, so you're Galileo, you know, because that's really, you know, that's like, so you're that level genius that you're Galileo. Congratulations, you know. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. And I think this is a good question to end on. Are you planning on writing another book on another famous historical person, perhaps another scientist? If not, what topic would you like to write about next?
So this unfortunately is something that I will not really answer, in the sense that I don't like to talk about my next book until I am relatively deep in the book. And I know that I will actually finish that book.
Right.
Look, I mean, I've written about scientists in the past. I mean, my book, Brilliant Blunders, for example, I chose 5 giant scientists, the likes of Darwin, Linus Pauling, you know, and so on. And Linus Pauling, by the way, he was from Portland, I believe. He studied at Portland State, actually, which is not in Portland, but he studied at
Hometown, yeah, hometown.
Oregon State. I'm not sure now anymore.
Oregon State.
Oregon State, yeah. Oregon State, which is not in Portland, but he's from that neighborhood. In Portland, there is a house that's called the Linus Pauling House, because it belonged, I think, to somebody from the family or something. I once actually attended a scientific discussion in that building. So there I had 5 scientists, and for each one, I talked about one very serious mistake that they have made. So I did discuss scientists in the past. I've never written anything that really looked like a full biography, like the one I've done here in the case of Galileo. So, you know, most probably, what I'm willing to say, most probably my next book will not be, again, you know, a full biography of a single person, is my guess. But I will not say more than that. And certainly, you know, I like to write about scientists, but from different disciplines.
Well, that's what's always made your work so interesting, is that you come at it from these different angles, which is always really, I mean, very illuminating. So, all right. Well, I think that's a good question to take us on out. Up where we don't
hear you. We don't hear you.
Thank you. Little technical difficulty there. Thank you so much to both Mario and Adam for joining us in conversation tonight. You can purchase a copy of Galileo by visiting us on powells.com. I've posted the links to both Mario and Adam's latest books in the chat right now, so you can head over there real quick, click on those, and take you out. So again, Mario Livio's new book is Galileo, and Adam Frank's most recent book is Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds, and the Fate of the Earth. Thank you so much for being here tonight. You can keep up with our lineup of other virtual events at powells.com. Have a good night.
And thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. That was fun.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Powells.